The Yallourn power station, the first of which was constructed in 1921, was situated on an 18-hectare site in the Latrobe Valley. The power stations were the genesis of the SECV. The first power to Melbourne was transmitted in 1924. Sir John Monash was the visionary who recognised the rich brown coal deposits of the Latrobe Valley as a potential energy resource. He saw the need for a power station, and he worked against established conservatism to establish an industry where none had existed. The SECV managed the coal deposits and the means of converting them to electric power, the Yallourn power stations. By 1989, A and B station boiler houses had been demolished, and the last power station, Yallourn E, had been decommissioned. With no further use for the plant, the decision was made to demolish it to ground level and rehabilitate the area. In 1992, the decision was made to privatise the Victorian electricity industry. The SECV would be no more. It was first disaggregated in 1993. Then the component parts were sold to private industry. From a thriving organisation of over 20,000 people in its heyday, by 1997, the SECV had reduced to a small group under Graham Brooke AM, who, as statutory administrator in early 1994, replaced the commissioners and the chief general manager. He had the responsibility of winding up the many residual interests and commitments of the SECV. It is perhaps fitting that one of the SECV's final projects was to supervise the demolition of the facility that started it all. Maintenance of the site, its building, plant and equipment had ceased when E Station was decommissioned. Hazards at the site were of concern, and if not addressed, the condition of the site would deteriorate further. After consideration of the alternatives, it was determined that the Yallourn power station should be totally demolished. The $49 million project was one of the largest in Australia and presented the SECV administrator with many challenges, not the least of which was finding a contractor able to handle the demands of the project. Before any major demolition began, the Heritage Victoria Advisory Committee required that the power station's past had been documented. Some items of plant were removed from the station and preserved for posterity. This meter, other meters and gauges, and a plough used to clear the original open-cut site are on display at the Powerworks Tourist Visitors Centre at Morwell in Gippsland. Tiles from the original turbine floor at A Station have been relaid around a model of the Yallourn power station. These and other memorabilia are preserved as reminders of the area's beginnings. Also on display at Powerworks is a bronze bust of Sir John Monash. The station was constructed mainly of structural steel and reinforced concrete, with much of the pipework, flanges and heat lining areas being clad with insulation materials containing asbestos. At the time of construction, such insulation was the state of the art throughout the world. Much of the complexity associated with the demolition related to the safe removal of the various hazardous materials. There was an understandable community concern over the potential risks associated with the removal process and the demolition generally. The SECV had a strong record in the management of hazardous materials, particularly asbestos thermal insulation materials, and required the demolition to be handled expertly and in accord with best practice and statutory requirements. Demolition started in 1995. However, after 27 months, the appointed contractor was relieved of the project, and it was resubmitted for tender. In January 1998, a new contractor was awarded the project, and work commenced in the following month. The first focus was to complete the task of locating and identifying the materials containing asbestos and other hazardous products. Those areas were sealed and work commenced on the removal. The work was difficult and very time-consuming and could only be carried out by licensed contractors. The materials containing asbestos were removed, bagged and finally buried in the EPA-licensed asbestos dump. Other hazardous materials were disposed of at appropriate EPA-licensed disposal sites. Stringent health and safety requirements were adhered to protect the workforce and the surrounding Latrobe Valley residents. The project was air monitored and inspected from start to finish by an independent occupational hygienist. The hygienist verified that the stringent safety precautions were being adhered to and that the site and surrounding area remained safe. The materials containing asbestos took more than 20 months to clear from the site. As specific areas were cleared of all materials containing asbestos, the demolition works could commence. More than 7,500 cubic meters of material were removed from the site and placed in the EPA-licensed asbestos dump. The demolition of the site was very complex and required specialist expertise. A world-class team of demolition specialists was assembled for the project, with the Yallourn power station being the 35th power station the demolition team had demolished. The close proximity of many services that are critical to producing electrical power for Victoria added to the complexities of the demolition works. The site is adjacent to the Yallourn W power station and a major electrical switchyard. The turbine hall straddled the 70-year-old concrete conduits that supply water from the Latrobe River to the Yallourn power station. Demolition works were carried out within stringent vibration limits and continually monitored for any effect on air quality. The turbine hall, approximately 400 meters long, or twice the length of the MCG, was demolished in sections at different stages during the project. Sections of the west wall of the turbine hall were retained until the adjacent boiler houses were demolished to provide added protection to the adjoining Yallourn electrical switchyard. There were complexities in clearing the generating equipment from the turbine hall, with many of the sections weighing in excess of 120 tons. The equipment and steel had to be cut into a reasonable size for transportation to the recycling centre. The turbine blocks were constructed of heavily reinforced mass concrete. They created more complications, with half the blocks being located directly over and their foundations connected to the 70-year-old concrete conduits. The blocks were demolished carefully, using heavy concrete breakers within stringent ground vibration limits, with no damage being caused to the conduits below. East Station Boiler House was demolished in sections until only the two boilers and their supporting steel structure and two concrete chimneys remained standing. Sections of the boiler house were cut free from the boiler support structure by specialist steel cutters. The supporting columns were then pulled away by heavy machinery. Once on the ground, further work by the cutters was needed to safely reduce the steel into smaller sections for handling and transportation. This method of demolition was adopted for all demolition works where possible. This provided a safer workplace for workers, as all the major cutting and breaking up of the remaining structure could be carried out at ground level. The 90-metre-high brick-lined reinforced concrete chimneys were the first of the major structures to be demolished. The major considerations in demolishing the chimneys using controlled explosives were to ensure that the chimneys could be dropped safely within the designated drop zone and within stringent vibration limits. After considerable engineering and planning, it was agreed that the work could proceed. A rubble wall was constructed around the base of the chimneys to catch any materials from the explosion, and pads were constructed for the chimneys to land on to reduce vibrations. The bases of the chimneys were then prepared for the demolition. Due to the close proximity of the Yallourn W ash line, switchyard, Loy Yang water conduits and pumping station, and this being the first major demolition drop, it was agreed that as an added protection to the Victorian power system, the electrical power output from the Yallourn W station would be reduced during the dropping of the chimneys. chimneys were demolished safely, within the vibration limits and within the engineering computations provided. The concrete and bricks were pulverized and used for recycling. The two remaining E-station boilers were supported from the top of the structure, and each weighed in excess of 3,500 tons. The engineering information obtained from the demolition of the chimneys verified the preparations for the demolition of the boilers. The rubble walls were constructed around each boiler, and a flat rubble pad was constructed for the boilers to land on. The legs were progressively cut to prepare the structure. Once the structure was prepared sufficiently, it was ready for demolition by the use of controlled explosives. The structures were demolished safely, with no damage to D-station or surrounding assets. Due to the pre-cutting, the structure collapsed down to a manageable size for further demolition at ground level. Again, very little is wasted, with the majority being recycled. The C and D boiler houses were both 80 metres long by 50 metres wide, and 100 metres to the top of the steel chimneys, and were demolished in a similar manner. The C-station boilers and surrounding structure attached to the bunkers were progressively cut and demolished. The steel chimneys on top of the boiler house were then cut free at the top of the bunkers and were carefully pulled until they toppled over onto the ground. The coal bunkers were the last section of the boiler house to be left standing. A 6-metre high rubble wall and an egg crate type landing pad was constructed on the south side of the bunkers. The lower floor was removed and the columns cut. The southern columns were then removed with the use of controlled explosives. D-station was the last to be demolished. But prior to demolition, there was an interesting perspective from the top of the boiler house. It shows the enormity of the demolition works and site. The tall yellow tank and pipeline is part of the Loy Yang water system that supplies water to Loy Yang power stations. The water supply system and electrical switchyard were some of the most valuable assets that the demolition team needed to retain without damage. There is also the remainder of the turbine hall and the rubble from C-station boiler house. Clearing the site took many months. It was done in a very methodical manner in accordance with health and safety requirements. Air monitoring of the site continued until all work was completed. Once cleared, extensive earthworks and regrassing were carried out to rehabilitate the site. The overall project was environmentally friendly, with the majority of materials from the site being recycled. All operations on site were conducted in accordance with the current Australian and world's best practices and experience. There were no major occupational health and safety issues on the project, and this was an excellent result by world standards. The skill of the planning, removal of all hazardous materials, demolition and rehabilitation were carried out with the best possible result. A job well done, and a tribute to all the people involved.